Organized money.
Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification button so that more people can get exposed to organized money. Really appreciate it. So I've made fun of you for this, Dave, but you just got back from Europe watching Eurovision, right?
That's right. So the Eurovision Song Contest is a thing that's been going on for 70 years in Europe, and it's basically American Idol, only every contestant represents a country. And they come together in this ridiculous show, which, is delightfully sort of Eurotrash in its conception. And the stage presence, the stage show is insane. It's really an incredible
Doesn't
experience.
everybody hate England?
Everyone hates England, and they got, I think, 0 votes in the fan voting, something like that. Yeah, England could win every time. Like, okay, we're sending Elton John again. We win. Like, and yet they don't, and they send these sort of theater West End people, and they always do terrible. But here's my point. It was probably the first time I heard new music in several years. I got to know all of these musical styles from different countries and new artists that I hadn't heard of before. And it seems to me that, Eurovision, this big contest, is one of the few places you can hear new artists anymore, because at least in the US, it seems like the mechanism for new music discovery has been folded into these streaming platforms where it's very difficult to break through.
So you're saying that it's not that it's like new music at scale, right?
Yeah. That's kind of what we're going to talk about today is the dominance of music streaming platforms, and particularly Spotify. And Spotify has a user base of 700 million people. It has 250 million paid subscribers. And kind of at the outset, it was kind of pitched as an opportunity for discovery. Hey, you have the entire world of recorded music right at your fingertips. You pay us a fee every month, and you don't have to collect CDs. We'll have everything for you, and you can listen to whatever you want. But people don't listen to whatever they want. They basically pick up these curations through playlists, some of which are artificial intelligence and algorithmically derived, some of which are created by individuals, some of which may be sort of manipulated by the major labels, which have a stake in Spotify. We talk about that later. And it just seems like it has changed the relationship between listeners and music. And it's also changed the relationship between artists and music and how they create music. And it's been really, really disruptive for an industry that, much like entertainment and storytelling, is part and woven into the fabric of our lives.
Yeah, there's sort of a flattening. I was watching like Dazed and Confused, that movie the other day, and it's like it's a bunch of teenagers that drive around and like listen to music on the radio. And that was something that was also in American Graffiti. And it's like, it's also, it's in
different music, but yeah.
Different music, but the idea of like you drive around and you like listen to a DJ, right? Somebody curating. Right. I mean, the silly biopic about Queen, like they had the, breaking this Bohemian Rhapsody by like talking to DJs. And that's all gone, right? There's like a flattening of our taste.
Yeah, there was a time.
Happening.
Yeah, I agree. There was a time when sort of music was evocative of a sense of place, a sense of time. It takes you, like the music and the life experience was very similar. And now it's just sort of background noise.
It's an algorithm.
That's kind of what Spotify has created, like this Muzak version of music that is ever present, but also just not really attentive for people. And we have a great guest to talk about this. She just wrote a book about Spotify. Her name is Liz Pelly. She is a writer based in New York. She's the author of Mood Machine, The Rise of Spotify and the Costs of the perfect playlist, and she's also a musician. So I think she has a unique perspective on this. And we're going to talk about Spotify, what it is, how artists get paid, what the business of it is, and how it's changed the business of music. And so we're going to do that right now on Organized Money.
All right, Liz Pelly, author of Mood Machine, The Rise of Spotify and the Cost of the Perfect Playlist. Thank you for being on Organized Money.
Thank you so much for having me.
Sure. I took notice of you because I did a story about music monopolies about 4 years ago, and kind of everything I was seeing had your name on it. You've been writing about this a long time. What got you interested in writing about Spotify in particular in the first place?
So I'm someone who, for a long time, has had like kind of one foot in the world of journalism and then another foot just in the world of independent music as
Mhm.
a participant. I started working as a journalist as a teenager. I went to journalism school. I worked at a newspaper, but I'm also someone who like lived at a house where I threw shows, worked at a venue for 5 years. I play in bands. I also have gone on tour a
Mhm.
few times. So I'm like also enmeshed in independent and underground music. And I think that being a participant in independent music and DIY to some extent kind of naturally gives you a sort of analysis of power. But something that I also am interested is the changing meaning of independence in music.
Hmm.
I think being involved in independent music historically and currently has always kind of involved uh, pushing this conversation of what does it actually mean to be independent? What is
Right.
independent? Independent from what? And in the mid 2010s, it seemed pretty clear that if the idea of independence in music was going to like hold up or be redefined, it should also involve some sort of interrogation of these large tech firms that were increasingly becoming partners to the major labels that were sort of pushing this narrative that they were democratizing music and leveling the playing field. Meanwhile, when Spotify launched, it was 18% owned by the major labels. So I
Right.
think I was also kind of interested in contributing to debunking that narrative a little bit.
Yeah.
So you were a journalist, or you're a journalist, and you've training in that, and you're in the independent and underground music scene. So you're like really looking for the high paid careers. Like you're just going straight for the money. Is that is that
Yeah,
is that
it's a
right?
pure money play. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so you recently did a little bit of research on the major record labels, and got talked to some people who were like, yeah, there's a major M&A wave there. And it was a little bit interesting. It was weird because like I think I read the investor docs from Universal Music and saw that like they're really big now, right? Which sounds like an obvious thing to say, probably to you in the industry, but I think a lot of people thought they kind of died, right? And what like is the industry, like the record labels, which I think were considered big villains for most of the 20th century, like are they back? And what's their relationship with Spotify? And did they almost die? Like what happened?
I think that it is important to remember that while, in the streaming era, there has been no shortage of anecdotes from smaller artists, from independent artists about how hard it is to make a living with streaming, about these paltry payouts, the penny fractions that artists get. Like major labels make so much money from Spotify. By the time this podcast is over, the major labels will have made millions of dollars from streaming. They're making like millions of dollars per hour from this model. So there's a lot of money that is being directed to the global recorded music business. There's part of the narrative of streaming is that streaming returns the global recorded music industry to growth, which is true. There's so much money in music, but um, you know, Spotify gives 70% of its money to the rights holders. The reality of that is that most of that money is being passed along to the major record labels. So
Hmm.
yeah, I think that, when we talk about like the problems in music today, it's as much like, looking into streaming services and these like various array of practices that they have normalized, cost saving initiatives that squeeze musicians in different ways that they're sort of sucking up user data and kind of engaging a surveillance capitalist model in music. But then there's also the influence that the major labels have. They're like still incredibly powerful. And in a lot of ways, what we're talking about isn't necessarily like a technology to be criticized, but a relationship between these tech firms and the major labels.
Yeah, and you touched on that, and we should say it more plainly. You mentioned that there's the major labels, which I don't think people realize, have this big stake, like an actual portion of Spotify, something that's been true since before the IPO of the company, and in some ways, do you feel like that sort of reflected a way out? Because the backstory is that there was MP3.com, then there was Napster, and there was this sort of piracy going on, and the labels were always trying to find a way to get a handle on that so the music wasn't being given away. And those services were sort of at odds with major labels. And then Spotify comes in and they buy in and kind of collaborate. Was Spotify sort of the solving of a problem for the major labels in some ways?
I think so. Yeah. I think something that the founders of Spotify seem to have recognized is that at this point in the mid 2000s, when they launched, so Spotify as a company was created in 2006, they launched in parts of Europe in 2008, and then in the United States in 2011. It was a moment when the major record labels were really struggling to recover from the impacts that file sharing had on their bottom lines. And I think Spotify realized that there was kind of like this consumer behavior that listeners and users had become accustomed to, which is being able to open your laptop and or your computer and with a few clicks of a button, like listen to whatever song you wanted to hear. And there was potentially a way for, instead of like convincing fans to start buying music again, like capitalize on the popularity of that user behavior. Originally their idea was to do that through an advertising model, but to capitalize it in some way that could also benefit the major labels.
Right. Yeah.
So, one of the things tell us about the origin of the company in 2006. So Daniel Ek and his co-founder, they were not music guys. They were ad guys, right? Which is weird for a company that does music streaming. What was music to them when they founded it? And tell us about the founding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they both had backgrounds in advertising technology. Like, of course, over the years, especially Daniel Ek would kind of try to like rebrand himself as a music guy. There's these sort of early press pics of him holding a guitar. And,
See,
Martin,
music, see?
yeah, Martin Lawrenson, his like, co-founder for years, like his Twitter bio was "everyone loves music," which like, true, like, but it
Hello,
wasn't a
fellow
music.
kids.
Yeah, exactly,
Totally.
exactly. Hello, fellow music fans. But yeah, they weren't music people. They came from the world of advertising, and the origin story sort of involves like Daniel Ek kind of like coming up with this idea for a way in which you could sort of like build on the trend of file sharing and P2P technology by creating some sort of like media delivery platform that would provide a large library of media streamed through the internet and supported by ad sales. So the original idea was like free plus ads. And then he pitched that to his co-founder. And at the time, in order for that product to be launched or to become a reality, it requires the participation of the major record labels. Because if what you're trying to offer is like a product where a consumer could come and search for any song they could imagine from across the history of like popular recorded music, you need buy-in from the major labels.
Sure.
And I should say before getting too ahead of myself as well, that, if you look at early interviews with the co-founders, early employees, when that model was like first imagined or by Daniel Ek. I mean, it wasn't necessarily like first imagined by him. There were other attempts at streaming services before, but the advertising aspect of it, it wasn't immediately clear that they would doing music. Early employees talk about how they had also considered audiobooks or product search or video. And there's this early conference appearance from Martin Lawrenson that I point to in the book where, he says, yeah, we were searching for the right traffic source. We knew advertising was going to be the business model, but we weren't yet sure what the traffic source was going to be. And I think that's really telling. Music was kind of like a traffic source for this broader media, ad-supported media streaming model that they were
They sound really dedicated to art.
But does it, but let me ask you, just does it matter, right, that they don't care about music, right? Like that Jeff Bezos doesn't care about books, Deezus don't care about music. The old record guys, they might have been really sleazy, but they cared about music, presumably. But why does it matter to have, like, if they're just doing middlemen stuff, like, don't you want people who are just good at being middlemen? Like, what is it? Who care? Why should we care?
I mean, I think it matters that there are a lot of people in the music industry who don't care about music and frankly, who seem like they don't listen to music. Like that also is a problem in the music industry, as well, or music industries. I think, that does like provide problems for, the types of music that get invested in by labels. But in terms of streaming, it doesn't necessarily set them apart from like Apple or Amazon or anything like that. Like, certainly there's also a lot of people at those streaming services who aren't music people either. I just think it's, from my perspective, it's kind of like a telling example in just terms of the narrative of the company, over the years, they sort of put forth the idea that like this company was started to save the music business. Like they've sort of put forth a kind of like mission driven like ideology in the early years. And it's kind of just part of like busting that narrative, I think.
That was kind of the vibe, right? Like you're going to be finally in control of your music. Don't worry about what some DJ plays. Like you're going to be able to have all of this in the palm of your hands. It's a revolution. It's freeing. But that's not really how it works, right? I mean, there's so much music that's streamed off these playlists that are made by other people. Like, can you describe that shift that in the listening behavior of people, like that went from, oh, I have all these options to I actually want somebody else to do it for me.
Yeah, and I think like a point that is interesting to remember, which is kind of a segue between what we were already talking about, is that I try to kind of, make this reminder that a lot of practices that we talk about when we talk about the streaming era and potential harms to artists, like, yes, there are things that are new, but I also think it's equally interesting that for a platform that sort of in, the mid 2000s positioned itself as disruptive, like other tech companies of the era, like actually a lot of the practices are really old, kind of like recreations of music industry dynamics that had lasted for a long time. So whether that's like, a company run by people who don't actually care about music, like branding themselves as music lovers, or you're talking about the prevalence of, what in the streaming era, the music industry calls lean back listening or passive listening. A lot of, I think, streaming culture is sort of defined by this, phenomenon that the music business is really capitalizing on the fact that streaming is a means of listening to music that sort of pushes and incentivizes a mode where users are not necessarily always like searching for an artist or album that they want to listen to, or a DJ or some sort of like, cultural curator, but instead are like picking a mood or a vibe and then kind of letting the, quote unquote, the algorithm take over. Of course, it's not one algorithm, but, in some ways it's new, but then also you could look at the history of commercial radio as a kind of lean back listening, not even just like commercial radio, but also something like Pandora, so it's not necessarily like fully accurate. This is like a phenomenon completely created by Spotify by any means, but I do think that it has been uniquely sort of pushed forward and championed in the streaming era because lean back listening is a way of kind of hooking users, boosting engagement, boosting streaming metrics and data, et cetera.
Yeah.
So I guess one of the things that, I mean, if you have someone who's like good at aerospace and they like engineering and they run Boeing. Like that's you kind of want someone to do that because the planes tend to crash if they're run by finance guys because they're not looking out for like the ecosystem of the engineering, which is hard and complicated. And I guess I would say there's probably I'm not I don't you know I'm probably the worst person in terms of music for you because I just like listen to whatever's on, right? And actually, it's been a problem for me because these I can't figure the Spotify era is like not good for somebody who's just trying to like listen to find new interesting music, and doesn't want to put too much effort into it. But it does seem like there's something that's been really damaged about our culture by these institutions that are run by people who don't care about the underlying product. They're not looking out for kind of an ecosystem at all. And they're not trying to make sure that there's any artistic merit to anything. And I'm not like one of these people that really cares about tastemakers, but that does seem like there is something that is kind of draining out of the ecosystem of artistic creativity. And you don't just see that with music, you see that with film and a bunch of other things. So I don't know, I think there's something that's really lost. But what can you talk about the algorithm which has sort of taken over? Like what, what, how, who decides who gets on like the playlist that Spotify puts forward, how they're marketing? And like, are there real people involved? Is it just like totally automated? Like, what is it?
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that, that makes sense as a question to follow on the point that you were just making, because I do think that one of the really kind of like defining aspects of this sort of cultural flattening of the streaming era really does have to do with the influence of data. Obviously, in some ways, like it's hard. You can't really compare like major labels because major record labels are sort of like venture capitalists who are kind of have this sort of commitment to like following the data and following numbers and metrics and money. But at least in the independent music world, or in amongst, labels that are kind of more grassroots or that serve smaller scale cultural production, there's this idea that it's like not everything needs to be all about just like following the data, and there's more room to like take chances, or invest in more challenging music or types of music that don't get like repeat plays in the streaming era.
Right.
As for the algorithms, yeah, definitely, I think always important to like use that word plural, because there's kind of this like um, uh, myth of like the algorithm single as this kind of like all powerful force in music today. But really what it is like, a series of different types of pools of data that streaming services are collecting on users and on music, and then like a series of different types of recommendation models that they're using to make recommendations. So, on streaming, like on Spotify, for example, there's data, yeah, that is collected on users, like your listening data, your listening history, so like behavioral data. And then on music, especially in the early years when they first introduced algorithmic music recommendation, they were collecting both what they call acoustic data, so like data having to do with what the music actually sounds like, and then what they called cultural data, so data about how people discuss the music online, how they discuss the music, the types of playlists people make on the app. So a really big source of input data for Spotify's algorithmic recommendations is just the types of playlists that people make on Spotify. So a point that I kind of make in the book is that, there's this type of Spotify listener that's like, yeah, well, all these playlists, they might be having this impact on culture, but I just make my own playlists. So like, I'm good. I'm not part of this. But actually, the playlists that people make on Spotify are part of the training data that they use to, create algorithmic data-driven recommendations. So if there's like thousands of playlists called driving mix, and there's this one song that's always on people's self-made driving playlists, then that song's more likely to be recommended when Spotify creates an algorithmic data-driven driving playlist. So that kind of thing. Um,
Yeah, and that seems to do like a few different things to what actually gets streamed. So there's this this sort of filtering effect upward that seems to value established artists rather than new music discovery. And then there's this like desire, if you're not in that set, you just have to take sort of a lot of shots at the target. There's like some guy who uploads 100 songs a day to try to catch like any trend that's going, and that's this sort of industrial packaging of music as widgets that you just keep throwing it at it and trying to nab some more streams. And then the third thing, when I wrote about Spotify in particular, I've had musicians tell me that, like, oh, my hook has to be in the first 10 seconds of the song, right? Because they can't skip away. And they basically told me it like literally changed the kind of music that gets produced because it's like the chase for the playlist, the chase for the stream. And so could you talk about some of those factors of the sort of filtering up and how music changes?
Mhm. Yeah. And again, I think a lot of it has to do with just all this data that artists are sort of drowning in. So when, users engage at Spotify, they're opening an app that is called Spotify. But some of the time when artists engage with the universe of Spotify, they're doing it through this app called Spotify for Artists, which I have a section of my book about. And
Hmm.
it's an app that's kind of like, a lot of different quote unquote creator platforms and apps like this have these sort of quote unquote creator focused dashboards, where artists can log in and it'll show them all their stats. So what playlists they were added, how many streams a song got, where those streams came from, and then also it's the interface that artists and their teams will use to then like buy ads and buy
Hmm.
sponsored shelves and enroll in various
This is like this is
quote
like
unquote
sellers on
promotional
Amazon. Like,
opportunities.
hey, if you want
Mhm.
to if you want to get on those playlists, you better buy some ads. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, totally. So I think even so, something that kind of came up in some of the conversations that I was having with people who run and work for independent record labels for my book was that even artists who aren't necessarily, there's a certain type of artist who might be in like a pop songwriting session who's sitting around with someone they're writing a song for or with, and they're saying, okay, like we want to write a song to end up on indie chill, and like that's their target, and they're writing for this
Indie chill, like a
playlist,
type of playlist
like a
that
playlist, yeah.
fascinating.
And in some ways it's like maybe that's not that different than people who decades ago were sitting around trying to write a radio hit. You're a pop songwriter, it's like you understand the assignment sort of thing.
Hmm.
But even amongst independent songwriters, independent artists, something that kind of came up in these interviews is that artists who, maybe intentionally and meaningfully have structured their careers in such a way that they've actively tried to remove themselves from a situation where they would be in a room with a songwriter who's trying to get them to write a song for the indie chill playlist, now also are kind of like confronted with all this data. And I think it can be kind of hard to sort of like insulate yourself from the sort of subtle ways in which
Right.
that kind of data can nudge you as an artist. And it's not just on Spotify. I mean, I think even, I think there's really interesting parallels with the sort of like Substackification of like the newsletter economy and like individual independent journalists and
And how
things
you
like
write.
that,
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. Like that's one of the reasons why as a writer, like those types of the kind of like creator economy coming for journalism, I think is also like a little bit gives me some pause.
Hmm.
But yeah, something that is a quote from the book and that I think about a lot is there's this one independent artist who I quote in the book who says that, in the streaming era, the only thing that has been democratized is the ability for everyone from, like a pop star down to like a bedroom producer to think about their own work the way that a Warner Records A&R person would think about it, like
Right.
looking at all this data, fine-tuned, roundtabling every hook, like doing everything to maximize engagement and potential growth.
Yeah.
Um, this is really sad. I mean, I just like saw a stupid Netflix documentary on Led Zeppelin, and they were talking about how FM radio changed the way they wrote music because they were like, we're now going to write albums because they play albums. And so it's always been a thing, but it definitely feels, if you analogize it to the creator economy and chasing the algorithm, it does feel sad, like a very sad thing. It certainly, I think,
But like it's a little
flattened.
different, right? Because radio was about discovery and then you could go buy the album. Here, those two things are kind of merged. And what we haven't got into and what we should is, and what a lot of people want to know with Spotify and all these digital streaming apps is how much the artists actually make, which is a pathetic amount and really eliminates recorded music as a revenue stream for everyone except for a few people at the top, right?
Mhm.
So,
Yeah. Well, my point was that technology has always heavily influenced the
100,
creation of content.
sure.
But this particular technological and political inflection point, because it's a choice about how to do this stuff, right? Um, seems like it seems kind of like a bummer. Like it doesn't have to make everything sad, but we kind of have. But I guess like there's something that I want to ask you about, and I want to get to like how much people make, but like, one of the things that I find really striking is that there was a law against payola, right? And there's like a lot of talk about payola, right? Which is pay for play, right? You pay the record, the DJ, and then they play your album or your record. That's illegal on the radio. But like there are a lot of allegations that this kind of thing happens in relation to Spotify, but that like it's more overt. And so, can you maybe explain Discover Mode? Um, is that legal? And how does sort of these kind of like deals that are or tacit deals and that between labels and Spotify, how do they work?
Mhm. Yeah, so I'll talk about discovery mode and payola like practices, and then talk about the royalty model. So, uh, yeah, discovery mode is a quote unquote, like program, quote unquote, opportunity that Spotify offers to artists and labels, where artists can take a 30% royalty reduction in exchange for algorithmic promotion on certain personalized playlists. So it's the playlists are daily mix. So, a lot of times when you open Spotify, the first thing that you'll see on the personalized homepage are these things that say like daily mix one, daily mix two, daily mix three. So daily mixes, and then radio. So if it's like, Stereo Lab radio or, artist radio, like
Mhm.
those types of things. And then autoplay. So if you have autoplay checked on, the music that just starts playing after an album or a playlist finishes playing. So those are like the three areas on the app that are impacted by discovery mode. So when you are listening to a daily mix or a radio or autoplay stream, autoplay feed, every few tracks there might be one by an artist that's either they've enrolled in or someone on their team has enrolled them. Sometimes artists don't even know they've been enrolled in these programs if
Mm.
their music is being promoted by their record label. Yeah, into this program. And I think, as soon as it was announced, and this was 4 or 5 years ago at this point, there was like very quickly backlash from the artists, the record label, lawmakers, calling this potentially a new type of digital payola, or as I have been instructed by people who know more about like legal terminology than me, a payola like practice. So that's because it's not technically payola. Payola has this like very specific legal definition that has to do with commercial with FM radio. And there aren't similar laws that exist
Right. It's
yet
the difference
for
between a
the
bribe
digital
and a
realm.
nudge. They're just
Yeah.
nudging you in that direction.
And another interesting difference is that, you know, in the
It's
streaming
not a
era,
bribe. It's an unseemly thing you do for money.
Well, it's also part of the business model, like it's also not secret, where
Right.
payola was
Under the
secret under the
table
table. This
rather
is
than
like,
over the table. Yeah.
yeah, anyone can, Google Spotify discovery mode and find their page on their website where they talk about the program and how it works. This is an example of how these sort of cost saving initiatives on the part of Spotify have been sort of built into the business model. And so that's a difference. Something that I think makes it really similar to payola, though, is that these tracks are not labeled. So, one of the
Mm.
reasons I think why there's so much confusion about this is if you're a user, if you're, using one of these apps or using Spotify and you're listening to one of these playlists and there's tracks on your daily mix or your artist radio that are there because of a commercial deal that is in place, like you as the listener have no way of knowing that. Obviously, like on their website, there are places where they describe the program
Right.
like in general, but you don't know like I'm getting this track because of a commercial deal in place. And it's my perspective that I think that should be labeled. And I think it's also one of the, there's kind of in my book, there's these two sort of investigations that it's a book of like reported criticism where some of it's cultural criticism and some of it's investigation, but there's kind of like these two more investigated aspects of it. One is into what I call ghost artists on playlists, where there's this kind of like long reported on practice of Spotify and other streaming services filling up their playlists for lean back listening, like their like
Is
chill
that called
playlists and sleep
perfect
playlists.
fit content or something like that, right? Is that one of
Yes.
the terms that gets used? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it's like for years, people on social media had kind of like speculated about this practice, calling them fake artists. But it turns out that internally, they actually have like this phrase for this type of music, and it's described internally as a type of perfect fit content is defined as like music commissioned to fit certain moods and playlists with improved margins. So that that's a cost saving initiative, but none of
Right.
that music is labeled. And I think it's kind of where there's
So they get a
similarity.
lower rate? Like how does that work? These artists that they sort of recruit to fill certain playlists, do they get a lower royalty rate than other artists, or how does that help them on their margin?
So I wasn't able to like specifically review any of the contracts that the musicians who make this
Hmm.
material have with the production companies that hire them. But like what I was able to learn is that there's this string of production companies that Spotify has licensing agreements with, and those production companies then in turn commission the music from musicians who sort of make it in bulk. And from talking to musicians who have participated in this, it seems like, each of these production companies has a different type of contract. Like some of the musicians were talking about buyout deals. Some of them were talking about there being some sorts of royalties that they get and some sorts of royalties that they don't get. But it clearly from just like, the way it was discussed internally clearly is like a cost saving initiative of some
Right.
sort. Yeah.
So, so if you're trying to play it straight, you're not hired by Spotify as a ghost artist or whatever, and you're just an emerging artist that's trying to find an audience, and you put your stuff on Spotify. Is it possible to find that audience without support from the label that is, putting you on playlists, just as an independent emerging artist who's trying to find people to listen to their music? Is that a possible function through Spotify or even other digital apps?
Mhm. Well, it's definitely a lot harder. I mean, if you're, the ghost artist phenomenon that specifically impacts musicians that make instrumental music. If you're making instrumental music like classical, jazz, lo-fi hip hop beats or ambient music, and you're not participating in like one of these weird arrangements,
Right.
it's super hard to, get playlist placement. So that doesn't mean it's like possible to find an audience, through other channels. There, like, a whole ecosystem of independent artists who are currently navigating how to you know, reach audiences and connect with listeners outside of relying solely on the streaming economy. There are, still like touring is still a huge part of how musicians promote their work, doing
Right.
press, radio, social media obviously has way too much influence over artists' abilities to have careers. And in some ways, I think that on like a day-to-day basis, like the grind of having to just be on social media all day probably takes even more of a toll than the
Hmm.
impacts of streaming does on artists.
That's
Because
interesting.
yeah, it's like artists are basically like expected to kind of be like content creators and their
Mhm.
own, publicists in addition
Right.
to
It's
everything
kind of
else. So
like I have described it in the past. It's like we had sort of the troubadour era where you'd have to go from city to city and hawk your music, and that was the way you made money. There was no recorded music to speak of. And then recorded music came in for a time, even though you usually get ripped off by the label on that. Uh, there was something tangible to sell, whether it was to sell at your concerts or whether it was a way to get on the radio or something like that. It's always been a hard business, but there was something tangible there. And now that's kind of gone away and people are troubadours again. And this time there are other monopolies that like Live Nation that take an even bigger piece of the pie and make it hard for a touring artist to be financially viable as well. So I mean, it seems like musicians are just beset on all sides.
yeah, I mean, if you talk to many independent musicians, there's also a comment that like comes up very often is that, today like independent musicians are like touring t-shirt salesmen. And
Right.
and then, in the domain of live merch sales, you have like this whole fight that's happening between the independent artist community and the venues right now over merchandise cuts, where like venues,
Mhm.
especially bigger corporate venues, feel that they're entitled to like 10, 15, 20, 30% of artists' merch sales that happen
Wow.
inside their venues, which is completely ridiculous. I mean,
Right.
even just like, starting to do a book tour, I'm like, if I was selling my books and a record store was like, oh, I want to have 30% of your book sales because you're setting up a table in the corner after you do it's like what it would be seem completely ridiculous. But it's actually super normalized in the music world.
Fortunately, publishing royalties are super straightforward.
No, no, actually it's like even worse.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We all know that. Go ahead, Matt.
So what like you said that there are independent. Okay, well look, one of the things I'm kind of curious about is like Spotify did a venture into podcasting, right? And I saw them do an attempt to kind of roll up that space. They bought a bunch of podcasting companies, then they bought a bunch of tools for podcasting, then they bought a bunch of podcasting ad tech companies. They signed like Joe Rogan to exclusive licensing deals. They did deals with I think of the Obamas. They did deals with the Harry and Meg. Like they tried to like
Bill Simmons
kind
was a
of
big deal, right?
yeah. That was the ringer, right? Like what happened with that? Like what was the strategy there? Did it fail? Like what and was this an indication that they don't really care about music? It's just content?
Mhm. Yeah, so admittedly, my book is about music and it's about the impact of Spotify on music. So
Right.
I haven't done as much research into po podcasting, Spotify's like podcast strategy or their audiobook strategy.
Mm.
Although that's something that is super interesting to me now as an author, and that I hope to research in the future. But with podcasting, it did seem that, there something that's kind of interesting is that, streaming services, Spotify included, or seem to always be in search of ways that they can cut costs. And their biggest cost of all is the amount of royalties that they pay to the recorded music business.
Right.
So through, the cost saving initiatives that are researched, that I've researched, it seems like there's no, uh, end to like what they'll try to do to reduce how much money they pay to the music business. And perhaps another strategy is finding new types of content that they can point people to where they don't have to pay royalties at all. And the podcasts would seem to fit that bill.
So one thing, and we skipped over a little bit, but my understanding of the royalty situation is on average it's, fractions of a penny,
Mhm.
and you have to hit a certain number of streams to even qualify for getting any money at all. Um, but I mean, I think if I put that to Spotify, they'd say, well, but this is exposure, and as you say,
Mhm.
musicians make money from touring.
Mhm.
But one thing I think is interesting is that so there is this big data trove. Like if you uh, uh, if you're a band, Spotify knows that there are 1,000 people who streamed your song X amount of times in a particular city, and you might be touring in that city. But does Spotify allow the artists to access that data and contact those fans? Like if it was really about exposure and giving the opportunity for artists to reach fans, you'd think there'd be some connection there. But does Spotify do any of that? And can you actually use that data as an artist to tell somebody about a show?
So there's some generalized data that artists have access to, like including, where the listeners are from. But something that, you don't have is the ability to simply just send a message to all of the people who follow you or communicate directly with all the people who follow or listen to your music. And that's the kind of thing that they charge you money in order to do. If you're an artist and you have a new album coming out and you want to make sure that all the people who listen to you on Spotify find out about it, like, of course, if you follow an artist on Spotify, theoretically, when they have new songs come out, they will end up on your release radar playlist. But not everyone who uses Spotify knows that the release radar playlist that you can navigate to through their interface is where you go to hear new singles by artists for whom you've clicked the follow button on. I don't even know if like most people who use this app know that you're supposed to click the follow button if you want to hear new music from the people you're interested in. But what they do is, if you want to have a pop-up show up when people who either like listen to your music once or listen to your music a lot, like open their app, that's something they charge you for. And they charge you
They
like per
charge you.
per click through. So, it's a
Nice.
thing where you like set a budget and then each time someone, maybe your label will spend like $1,000. And then each time someone
Right.
clicks the ad, it's like 35 cents or whatever. And then once you've got through the whole budget, then the pop-up ad is over. I've
Right.
literally like heard stories of artists being like, people being like, if you see one of these pop-up ads by one of your favorite artists, don't click it because they'll get charged money. Um, uh, so
Wow. So it's very easy for Spotify to manipulate the data and very hard for an artist, in other words.
yeah, yeah, that's why I mean, for the past few years, I've like taught undergraduates in a recorded music program, and I just teach them writing. But something that I always say is like, if you're an independent artist, like the most powerful thing you could have is an email newsletter, like something that allows you to directly
Mm.
communicate with
Right.
the people who are interested in hearing from you.
Yeah.
And I think if you're interested in keeping up with an artist, that's probably one of the most effective ways that you could do it is signing up for their newsletter or the
True in
newsletter of their
journalism,
record label. Yeah.
true in
Yeah.
journalism and podcasting too. OrganizeMoney.fm, sign up.
Yeah, yeah, because otherwise, then artists are just like left to the whims of platforms like Spotify, and
Yeah.
who knows like what other types of services they'll, figure out ways to make artists have to pay for
Well,
in the future just to reach the
Mhm.
people who've expressed interest in their
well,
work.
so what alternatives are there to Spotify for artists, for fans? And is there actually like an escape from the big platforms or big platform?
Yeah, yeah, there are a lot of alternatives, and I think that the question of effective alternatives definitely is different depending on who you're talking to. Especially given the reality that there are so many different types of music fans with different types of commitment and interest to exploring alternative ways of engaging with music. One of the issues of the streaming era is this idea that it puts forth about this one size fits all solution for music. So something I always say is that when you're, imagining the alternatives or talking about alternatives, it kind of requires moving past the sort of one size fits all solution. And sometimes it could be really unsatisfying because I do think that there are some consumers who kind of want just can you tell me an app to download that is more
Right.
fair than this app? And if that's like the case and you're looking for kind of like a one-stop shop, like sort of solution, it's not like a perfect answer because it's also a tech company that comes with some of the trappings of corporate tech company ownership of music. But like Bandcamp would probably be like the first thing that comes to mind. Being a platform where you buy music directly from, and the vast majority of that money is deposited into their, bank account within a few days, or their PayPal or whatever. That said, Bandcamp also has a lot of power and influence over like the specific independent music ecosystem. And right now, I actually, there's more people working on like alternative, independent, open source, cooperative alternatives to Bandcamp than there are people working on alternatives to Spotify, I'd say. I mean, I also have people in my inbox like literally every day, like who are working on the new app that's going to save the music industry. So there's like, no shortage of that as well. Something that I argue in the book though is that it's not necessarily like streaming necessarily that, needs to be solved for. Because I don't know if it's like the idea of, having music stored on a central server and then using the internet to stream it, that is the problem, but more like the way in which streaming services under the sway of major labels trying to cut costs and reduce royalty payments, like industry practices that are really the problem. So something I point to in my book that I like continue to be inspired by and that I continue to think is a really interesting model is this example of public libraries around the United States starting their own local music streaming services, where artists are paid like a flat stipend, not much, but something, and then the music being available to stream or download for library card holders. And then it also kind of serves as, these services serve as these kind of like local music archives for these different cities.
Yeah, that was a really interesting part of the book, and there's I believe something like that in Los Angeles. I haven't tested it yet, but it's really interesting. I was talking to like a policymaker about, and I said I'm doing this show, and he said, well, we're trying to come up with something about regulating Spotify as a public utility. And I don't know if this is that, but using public libraries in this fashion is kind of, it's a step toward that. And it's really an interesting possibility as a locale for serving, a public streaming platform. It's really mind expanding. I thought that was a super interesting part of the book.
There's a joke in there about someone being like, shh, it's a library. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, you'd be surprised how many libraries have like musical instrument lending libraries, recording studios, like practice spaces. I think,
The
yeah,
instrument
there's,
thing is great. Yeah, no, I've heard about
yeah,
that. Yeah, it's cool.
yeah. And so I think
Fortunately,
that's
they
like,
were made like hundreds of years ago, or else there would be no way a library would ever exist today.
yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true and very sad. But one of the things I like about that example too is that, these exist. Like there's these examples. Like I think that it's really funny because there's definitely some people in the music business who'll be like, oh, that's just an idealistic idea that can never work. And it's like, well, they already exist. Like
Right.
actually, like of
There is
course,
one.
anything associated with the public library is like under threat and needed more funding, like need more public support. But it's not that hard to imagine because there are all these examples already of this being something that exists. And then I also talk about like cooperative alternatives to streaming to like groups of musicians who have worked on starting artist co-ops that kind of like put
Hmm.
forth different ways of looking at streaming economics and royalty model.
Yeah, great.
So I have a question, I guess, final question, and this gets to sort of maybe like it's something we're starting to ask a lot of our guests about the communities that they're operating in. So we talked to uh, someone about like how doctors are responding to consolidation in medicine. We're talking to different people about um, and is the are musicians broadly speaking becoming more politicized? Like everybody wants to start an app to fight, to save the music industry. But really, this is like a political problem, right? Like it's crazy that we would say, oh, this supercomputer we keep in our pocket that you can pay for stuff and also listen to anything is the reason that we don't have a viable industry. Like that's insane, right? To think that. It's just obviously the choices we've made about how to create
Right.
and sell and distribute music are what's leading to this. But what we find, I think, what we're hearing in a number of the different it, people we talk to is that in kind of industry after industry, um, people are not necessarily drawing the right lessons, right? They're not necessarily getting politicized around that about, or there's a polarization where some people are saying, yes, the problem is this consolidation trend or whatever it is. And then some people are like, yes, it's just a job. I'm going to screw it. I don't care. Like what's happening? Like if you could interpret the politics of the music industry, like what's happening? How are artists thinking about the problem?
Yeah, it's hard to, speak definitively about the whole music business because
Speak for the whole music industry. You have
Yes,
10 seconds.
please.
Tell us
music is so
everything.
vast and there's like so many
Right.
different, ways in which artists engage in music, and ways that musicians think about their relationship to their labor, as well. But there's, chapter 18 of my book, it's called the New Music Labor Movement. And I'm specifically sort of chronicling the um, rise of, kind of different musician solidarity organizations, solidarity groups over the past few years. And I follow in that chapter the story of this group called United Musicians and Allied Workers.
Yeah.
And that's definitely something that I think of as super exciting in terms of independent musicians becoming more politicized in recent years. And kind of really like in some ways, I think reflects a really interesting like evolution of the idea of independent music too. Like, I think uh, independent music currently, there's a lot of forces in the music industry kind of putting forth this idea of the independent artist as this like solo creative entrepreneur, almost like influencer type figure, hustling and posting on TikTok every day and running their own small business. So then to have it kind of countered by this real sort of like movement of artists, not unionizing per se, because independent musicians in the United States are independent contractors. And if they unionize, they could be considered an illegal cartel. But creating these organizations, these solidarity organizations to sort of like do different campaigns. So United Musicians and Allied Workers did this Justice at Spotify campaign a few years ago that I think was really effective in messaging, at least, like, helping sort of raise awareness of different issues that artists face in the streaming era, whether it be like with royalties, payola like practices, the lack of transparency around streaming contracts. So most artists will never get to review the contracts that exist between their their label or whatever rights holder represents them and streaming services. They're highly secretive and protected by NDAs, and that's sort of like a main problem to fixing streaming.
Mm.
And that was part of their campaign, like transparency around contracts. And then in addition to Justice at Spotify, I talk about this bill that that United Musicians and Allied Workers wrote alongside Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib's office, called the Living Wage for Musicians Act, which is a bill that sort of puts forth this idea for a new streaming royalty that would go directly from the streaming services to the performing artists, and is modeled on research. The bill was written also in collaboration with the Harvard Cyber Law Clinic, and there's like a lot of research on pre-existing laws that exist around digital radio, that make it so that there's a certain type of royalty that goes directly to artists and not necessarily to the rights holders, because that's kind of, we didn't talk about the royalty model, but the the royalty model for streaming is extremely convoluted, and
Okay.
streaming services do not pay artists directly. They pay rights holders. This really complicated revenue share system called pro rata, where rights holders are paid not according to number of streams, but according to this revenue share model called stream share, like a market share, basically. If you're a rights holder and your catalog accounted for 20% of the streams in a given royalty period, you get 20% of the eligible royalty pool according to what your contract dictates is the eligible royalty pool. And that is apparently different for each contract that exists between a rights holder and a streaming service. And then the rights holders in turn have contracts directly with the artists where they get their slice of the pie and then divide it up amongst their artists according to the contracts that they have with their artists. So, and that, Spotify has no control over or doesn't even really see what happens to money beyond that.
Mm.
So yeah, we were asking about like artists being politicized though. Like the fact that from my perspective, the fact that like a story about, the impact of streaming on artists could end with like collaboration between a musician solidarity organization and the, office of a sitting US Congresswoman who is, working with them to put forward this idea, I think is extremely unique in terms of the politicization of independent musicians in this country.
That's great. Liz, thank you so much for coming on Organized Money. Liz Pelly is a writer and editor based in New York and the author of Mood Machine, The Rise of Spotify and the Costs of the Perfect Playlist. It's a great book. Go get it. And Liz, thanks for being on.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I thought that was a really good conversation. One of the interesting things about, one of the interesting things I've noticed, at least I went through it because I'm not a huge I'm not aggressively a fan of music. I just do
I don't like
easy.
music.
I don't like.
I don't like feeling happy.
I'm not like
I don't like.
I'm told humans like rhythm, but that is, no, I just like whatever you put on, I'm going to listen to, right? I'm not one of these people who like ever like super got into certain bands or whatever. And, but like I did sort of have this vague impression that the record industry died. Right.
Yeah.
And
I think a lot of people did, I mean, there was this whole thing about file sharing
Napster
and that was 25 years ago. And the idea was that, companies can't sell CDs anymore. And so, and there's kind of a relationship between that and maybe journalism or other things where there's a platform in between. And the assumption is the platform takes all the money and leaves the companies that create the product by the side of the road. But what we learned in this interview is that actually the companies are very much aligned and very much integrated into Spotify. They have 18% of the company, and they're making massive amounts of money from this relationship with the platform. So they kind of bought in a way that's maybe in other contexts you don't see that.
Right. I mean, my impression, and as somebody who's kind of like distant from the music industry and has no internal joy or soul or anything like that, is that, sure. It wasn't like everyone knew that the A&R guys were like evil, like the record companies were bad. Like I remember in the 90s, Pearl Jam was super mad at Ticketmaster, all the rest of it. And then it kind of went away, right? Because Napster killed it all. The internet like killed music, right? And but like I did a piece on the record labels, and basically in 2015 that was the bottom, and then now it's gone way up, and now they're making more money than ever, and Spotify's a big part of it. And there's like an interesting sort of cultural dynamic where it's like, oh, all the stuff that big tech is doing, all the stuff that like these other monopolies are doing, the record companies are doing, and Spotify is doing. And I hadn't realized that. And a lot of the sort of self-preferencing that you see is going on, like no monopoly, like they're not really that special. They all do sort of something similar.
Yeah. I think it's been a combination of those tactics And also the fact that the major labels consolidated pretty massively in the wake of Napster. And
Yeah.
so
And
now you basically have three major labels, and that's it.
they're still consolidating too. They're continuing to buy, and they're globalized too. Like that's the other thing that's happened is they're buying a lot of like music in Asia and Latin America and whatnot. And they're also, you know, they're getting into data. And so it's just this like there's just there, you know, the other thing is like the A&R guys, you know, there was a lot of bad behavior and like evil stuff going on in the 20th century
Yeah,
around
absolutely.
music, like pillaging black artists and so on and so forth. The thing that I think is different is that the people that were doing that, or one of the things that was different, did actually know music. They knew how to, like the evil guy was like, I can make a hit, right?
It's kind of like if you see the movie Elvis, and Colonel Tom Parker hears Elvis on the radio,
Yeah.
and he's like, "Oh, there's something to exploit."
Yeah,
Right?
yeah. He's like, I can
But
see, I can exactly. And he has to know, he has like the talent to
right.
know, like, oh, people want that, right?
Yeah,
But
exactly.
the founders of Spotify, it could just be hamburgers or widgets or whatever. Like they're just like and that there's like a soullessness to it because they don't know what sells and they don't care. They're just sort
It
of like,
doesn't
we're going to
matter
get market
because
power, right?
they have such market power that they can sort of dictate to you what shows up on the playlist and what you're going to listen to, and you kind of spin through it without even knowing it, right? So it's like you don't have agency in what you like about music anymore in some ways.
Right. I mean, and not to be like, it's so funny. We're like, no, the nostalgic for the old oligarchs.
Right. Yeah,
No, but I don't mean to say that. But like, you
the
had to.
history of recorded music is a history of exploitation, and this is just a different kind of exploitation. And
Well, I think that's unfair to the old music industry because I do actually, while there was a lot of exploitation, music also bound us together, and there were community, there was ecosystems, there was
right, they've
extractive
taken
behavior.
more away this time.
Well,
I agree.
they've taken away the soul of it. I think that's really
Right,
the key is like
right.
the musicians today they're writing their songs for this soulless platform. And that is really not
It's
okay.
it's clickbait, but at a different level. Like you're writing to the algorithm. We saw the pivot to video, and everybody
Right.
search engine optimization, and everybody in writing trying to make sure they get a good Google page rank. But with Spotify, it's the same kind of thing. Only you're like writing music to the algorithm.
I
It's
guess so.
bizarre.
There's one last thing which we haven't mentioned, which is kind of hilarious. And that is a completely different part of Spotify, which is that they're fighting with Apple and Google, but particularly Apple, because Apple is extracting from Spotify to let them get into the App Store. And in that sense, like Spotify is like the kind of the victim of the monopolist.
Right.
And so it's like hilarious to see this because they were actually important.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. I mean, all of these monopolists, when they sort of overlap in an area, there's this kind of war of all against all, and so your enemy can become your friend in some ways.
Look at you with quoting Hobbes. That's
am I?
Well, I think did he say?
I came up with that myself, and I'm copywriting it.
I think Hobbes did that in the 1600s, but whatever. The copyright's over. You can take
nice.
that.
Public domain. I'm taking it over.
Yeah.
All right. That was great. And you should definitely buy Liz's book. It's fascinating. And we will be back next week with another episode of Organized Money.
Organized Money.